Before we begin, take a deep breath and let the noise of the day slowly fade. Unclench your jaw, soften your eyes, and let the weight of modern life melt away. Tonight, we're not chasing action or drama. We're wandering into the forgotten corridors of boring history, where medieval echoes linger and dark tales unfold like fading ink on parchment. Welcome to Midnight Sleepless, a resting place for tired minds, where the Middle Ages, ancient empires, and strange, dark history stories drift by like soft clouds. Here, knights, castles, and quiet empires return not with a roar, but with a whisper. Let me know in the comments, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it there? And if you enjoyed these slow, sleepy journeys through medieval times, boring facts, and forgotten worlds, a gentle tap on the subscribe button helps keep this calm storytelling alive. Now, let the story begin. It is the 1920s. And the world outside is changing fast, but within the walls of this home, rhythm and routine create a sanctuary. Here, a woman moves through her day with steady hands and quiet strength, combing a daughter's hair in the early light, boiling coffee in a heavy tin kettle, folding linens warm from the line. Her gestures are small, but they carry the weight of generations and the grace of resilience, passed down like heirlooms. So rest your thoughts now. Close your eyes if you'd like. Let the hush of history cradle you gently. If you find comfort here, you are welcome to subscribe for more nights like this. And if it feels right, tell us where and when you're listening. We'll be here, always, in the stillness between now and then. The light that filtered through the lace curtains each morning was not sharp or hurried. It arrived slowly, with the soft confidence of routine, sliding across the dark mahogany floorboards and warming the wooden table that stood patiently in the center of the front room. Outside, the world of Harlem in the 1920s stirred to life with the hushed creak of delivery carts and the polite bell of the milkman's approach. Inside this brownstone third floor, west facing the day began at its own unbothered pace. The woman who rose before the city truly woke did not need an alarm clock. Her waking was governed by rhythm, not urgency. She lifted herself from beneath the neatly tucked quilt, her feet finding the familiar softness of a braided wool rug, woven long ago and still holding the faint scent of lavender sachets stitched into its underside. The bedroom smelled of old pine furniture and the faintest trace of rose pomade, used the night before to smooth her hair for sleeping. With slow movements, she dressed in the quiet light, the fabric of her house dress rustling gently as she buttoned it down the front. Her arms moved with the grace of long practice, not of performance. There was no audience in the room, save the mirror, its edges flecked with age, holding the muted reflection of a woman ready to step into the small responsibilities of another day. In the kitchen, which faced the back alley where cats and sparrows shared the early hours, the kettle was already on the stove, not from haste, but from habit. She had lit the gas with a long wooden match, its sulfur briefly tickling her nose before the quiet blue flame flickered to life. The kettle, made of worn tin with a handle wrapped in fabric to keep fingers cool, began its slow, warm dash up. She reached for the coffee tin, its metal lid cool and familiar beneath her hand, and spooned the ground beans into the percolator. The scent that drifted up, rich, bitter, earthy, was the same one her mother had taught her to prepare on cold mornings in Savannah, long before Harlem had called her north with promises of wages, respect, and something softer than the sharpness of the Jim Crow South. The floor beneath her feet creaked just slightly as she moved. A sound that never startled it was as familiar as the breath of the house itself. In the corner of the kitchen sat a small crate of potatoes, a sack of flour, and a tin of lard, each item part of the morning's possible choreography. But today, it would be toast made from day-old bread, sliced and browned on a skillet, then spread with apple preserves she had canned the summer prior. As the coffee began its rhythmic bubble, She opened the window just an inch. The air outside smelled of wet brick and distant coal smoke. But there was also the hint of something sweeter. Maybe someone was baking bread down the block. The breeze moved through the room slowly, brushing the gingham curtain and lifting the edge of the newspaper left folded on the table. Headlines didn't draw her interest as much as a crossword, which she would attempt later with a pencil worn almost to the eraser. Her daughter's footsteps were still absent. The girl, no, more than 9, slept soundly in the other room, her hair neatly braided into rows that would last another day or two. The child's room held the scent of chalk and lavender oil, and just outside its doorway sat a basin for morning washing, filled and ready with water gathered late last night. Back in the kitchen, the toast sizzled on the pan. She turned it with practiced care, using a fork with a chipped handle that had belonged to her aunt. The taste of the bread, once served, would be warm, faintly yeasty, and touched by the sweetness of the apples preserved in sugar and cinnamon. The combination was simple, but it grounded the day, whispered of continuity. There was music, faintly, rising from a neighbor's gramophone, perhaps Fats Waller or U.B. Blake. The notes curling through the window panes like smoke. She didn't pause to listen, but she noticed, just as she noticed the way the light now spilled more confidently across the floor, catching the glint of a tin measuring cup and the glossy surface of the waxed oilcloth covering the table. All around her, life was already moving, though quietly so. Its home, like many in Harlem during this decade, held its own rhythm, drawn not from wealth, not from spectacle, but from the quiet dignity of tasks done well and mornings honored with care. There was something sacred in the way time unfolded here, not with urgency, but with steadiness, with intention, and in that rhythm, in that slow blooming of morning light and sound and scent, was something else to something less tangible. A kind of inheritance, passed not through coin or deed, but through muscle memory and daily grace. Amen. It moved through the room like a ghost, not to haunt, but to witness, to remind myself, as the coffee hissed its final note and the toast browned just enough on the edges. She moved to set the table not for a feast, but for another quiet morning where the past and present coexisted gently in the rising Harlem sun. There was a certain silence that followed breakfast in the household, though it was not absence, it was fullness, the kind of quiet that lingers when warm plates have been cleared, when the coffee has gone lukewarm in its cup, and when the day waits with its gentle tasks. The morning light now stretched long across the hallway, catching dust in golden suspension, casting the shape of the lace curtains across the polished floor. The woman moved with purpose, though never in haste. Her house slippers whispered softly across the wood as she tidied the kitchen. Each movement had a kind of rhythm to it, learned not from instruction, but from repetition, from long days spent in other kitchens with other women, mothers, aunts, neighbors, each one passing along gestures like recipes. She rinsed the dishes in a basin set with tepid water. The soap, shaved from a thick block and dissolved just enough to cloud the surface, carried the faint scent of lemon and lye. As she worked, her hands were steady palms, calloused from years of laundry, scrubbing, and sewing, yet her fingers still moved with care, never clattering the plates outside. The neighborhood slowly gathered momentum. From the front parlor window, if one stood just so, the street below revealed a mosaic of life. Vendors passed with pushcarts of fruit and fish, shouting their wares with voices softened by distance. A woman across the street swept her stoop, each stroke of her broom rhythmic, like an instrument tuning the street's morning score. Somewhere a radio played faintly, its crackling voice delivering news or song, always too far to follow, but always close enough to feel. She paused in her cleaning to draw open the parlor curtain, letting the full light in. The room held its own quiet personality, a settee with firm cushions, worn at the corners but freshly brushed. doilies rested like gentle snow on the chairbacks, hand-stitched in the evenings with tired but willing fingers. The wallpaper, a pattern of muted roses and trailing vines, had faded slightly over the years, but its charm remained intact. The room smelled faintly of beeswax from the recent polishing, and perhaps also a hint of coal dust that clung no matter how often she cleaned. By now, her daughter had begun to stir. The soft sound of bare feet padding across the linoleum of the hallway signaled her slow descent into wakefulness. The child would enter the kitchen soon, her braids slightly frayed from a night of sleep, her eyes blinking against the light, and when she did, there would be no sharpness in the morning greeting. Only the quiet hum of continuity. The day's work would begin in earnest after breakfast. There were clothes to wash, though it wasn't a wash day. She preferred to keep ahead of the tan linens to shake out and hang over the banister. She gathered them in a wide wicker basket, worn smooth at the rim, and carried it out to the narrow back balcony. Here, the scent changed. It was still urban-laced with chimney smoke and the tang of city stone, but mingled now with the freshness of morning air, touched by the recent rain. Pigeons cooed from the rooftop edges, and a neighbor's voice, muffled by distance, sang a hymn low and slow. She pinned each garment with methodical care, her hands working steadily, her breath even. Each clothespan held a memory small, wooden, unremarkable, yet essential. The shirts, the slips, the pillowcases fluttered gently in the breeze, catching the light and moving like silent flags of a quiet nation, a nation made of care, of repetition, of invisible labor that held homes together, inside again. She swept the floor with a straw broom, the scent of the bristles mingling with the wax of the boards. As she moved through the rooms, she adjusted small things: a slightly tilted frame, a crooked cushion, a chair pulled askew. These corrections were not necessary, strictly speaking, but they were part of the pattern, and the pattern itself brought a kind of calm doubt. Later in the morning, Tiltashauser had paused, and the daughter was occupied with her slate, board, and chalk. She would sit, just for a moment. The chair by the window welcomed her with its familiar creak. In her lap, a bit of mending, nothing urgent, just a button to reattach. It seemed to reinforce. The needle moved in and out with soft precision, and in those moments, time shifted. It no longer moved with the city outside, but followed her own quiet current. If she looked out the window, she could see the stoops across the way, where other women also worked, paused, and sat. There was a kind of communion in that glance, silent acknowledgement of labor shared, of routines mirrored in other homes. No words were needed. The nod, the glance, the shared stillness, that was enough. The radio remained off in her home. For now, she preferred the quiet, the natural music of her day, the creak of wood, the hush of fabric, the distant murmur of neighbors. The loudness could wait until evening, when her husband returned from his shift. When supper was cooking, and conversation, however spare, filled the rooms once more, and so the day unfolded, not with noise or interruption, but with a softness born of familiarity. This was the shape of her mornings, not marked by clocks or alarms, but by the angle of the sun on the floorboards. The scent of toast now long faded, the feel of cotton pulled from the line and folded while still warm as the noon hour approached. She rose again, not with reluctance, but with the quiet understanding that life, even in its gentlest forms, continues to move. By midday, the brownstone had shifted into a softer rhythm. The sunlight had climbed high and now rested at a gentler angle, casting warm ovals of light on the parlor rug and illuminating the motes of dust that danced in slow spirals. The morning's work was done, not with celebration, but with the quiet contentment that comes from completing tasks that, while invisible to the world beyond, held the home in its familiar balance. She sat for a few minutes again, time with a cup of tea loose leaves steeped in a chipped porcelain cup, its rim lined faintly with a silver edge, now dulled by time. The taste was faintly floral, calming on the tongue, and still warm enough to comfort. She sipped slowly, eyes half-lidded, fingers cradling the cup as though it, too, had earned a moment of rest. The daughter played nearby, drawing shapes and letters on a piece of brown wrapping paper smoothed flat upon the floor. She hummed softly to herself, tuneless but contented, a lullaby of her own making. The mother watched without comment. There was no need to interrupt the quiet spell of the afternoon. Soon there would be a bit of ironing to do, just a few blouses, carefully dampened and wrapped in a cloth earlier to soften the wrinkles. She would press them on the heavy wooden board kept behind the kitchen door, heating the iron on the stove and testing it with a sprinkle of water, listening for the soft hiss that signaled readiness. The scent of warm cotton and faint starch would fill the kitchen air, not unpleasant, and the sound of fabric smoothing under the weight of the iron had its own sleepy rhythm. These hours were not hurried. They stretched in a way that felt both full and light, as if time in this space were not measured in minutes, but in textures and motions. The softness of worn linen, the scent of lavender water used to freshen clothes. The way her daughter's braids swung gently as she moved, all became the quiet notations of a life lived with steady care. The radio might be turned on later, just before her husband returned from work. A low volume, perhaps a sermon replayed, or a gentle piano tune, something that would fill the space without pressing too firmly against it. The child would sit and watch her mother prepare supper, asking questions now and again about measurements, about where cinnamon came from, or why onions made her eyes water. Each answer would be offered slowly, evenly, as much to maintain the calm as to instruct. Tonight's meal would likely be something simple, perhaps stewed greens with a bit of salt pork, and cornbread baked in a cast iron pan. That preparation itself was meditative. The way the knife slid through the thick leaves, the scent of garlic rising as it hit the oil, the soft bubbling of broth in the pot. These sounds were familiar, grounding. The kitchen, though modest, held the weight of tradition, not just recipes, but gestures, repetitions, the comfort of flavors passed hand to hand. By the time her husband's footsteps sounded on the stairs, the room would be warm with evening softness. His entrance, marked by the gentle scrape of boots at the door and the low murmur of his greeting, would fold neatly into the quiet the day had built. Their exchange of words was seldom long, but it was complete. A nod, a brief comment about the weather or the foreman's mood, a question about the child's learning, then the washing of hands, the setting of the table, the slow and steady meal after supper. There would be a brief hour where the light dimmed further and the family sat together, sometimes in silence, sometimes with a book read aloud in calm cadence. The daughter might stitch beside her mother, or press her head into her father's side while he rested. These were the hours that held nothing remarkable in themselves, but everything important in their presence. And when night finally arrived, when the dishes were dried and returned to their shelves, when the daughter had been bathed and tucked beneath the quilt again, and when the kerosene lamp was dimmed just low enough to cast a golden glow across the room, she would sit once more in the chair near the window. Outside, Harlem continued its slow nighttime pulse. Voices drifted up from the stoop. Somewhere a trumpet played a lazy tune, rising and falling like breath. She would not write in a diary, though she had once tried, a record of the day lived. Instead, in the smoothness of the floor she had swept, the even stitching of a mended collar, the scent of soap on her daughter's skin. These things were unspoken, but they remained, and in this, perhaps, was the quiet resilience of so many women like her, those whose names would not be written in headlines, whose homes would not be preserved in museums, but whose presence carried generations forward. They lived not for recognition, but in a deep rhythm of days like this one. Gently held and quietly passed on. She extinguished the lamp, the room going dark with a familiar hush. The fabric of her nightdress whispered softly as she folded herself into bed. Another day had been completed, not with grand events or distant journeys, but with small, necessary acts of care that together formed the story of a life. And asleep crept in like fog over quiet waters. She lay still, listening one last time to the night air, to the faint sound of footsteps below, to the creak of the old pipes, into the deep stillness of a home settled into peace. The back porch of the brownstone was narrow, shaded, and not meant for grandeur. It was a small rectangle of space pressed against the alley, overlooking a brick wall shared with the building next door. And yet, in the soft rhythm of daily life, it served as a kind of threshold, a place between the interior hush of home and the distant hum of Harlem streets. Here, in the quiet mid-afternoon, a woman stood with a basket of freshly laundered clothes. The sun was warm, but not fierce. Its light, broken by the fire escape above, and softened by the gauze of laundry lines, already half filled. The basket rested against her hip, its weight familiar and steady, filled with shirts, underslips, kerchiefs, and towels, each item bearing the faint scent of lye soap and the sweetness of bluing powder, left to dry in the gentle breeze. The porch boards beneath her feet were worn smooth by years of footfall and weather. There would held a mild sense and warmed pine mixed with something deeper, the scent of time itself, perhaps, or the residue of years of careful hands and quiet afternoons. She placed the basket down beside her and reached for a towel, its edges crisp with sun and the lines firm grip. Folding was not merely a task, it was a ceremony. Her fingers moved not quickly, but with intention, smoothing each edge, aligning corners, pressing creases with the flat of her palm. She did not rush. The quiet was her companion, and the sun dappled through the slats of the railing, painted shifting patterns on her arms below her in the alley. A stray cat watched lazily from the top of a garbage can lid, tail flicking now and then. A neighbor 2 doors down hummed an old hymn, her voice rising in bursts above the sound of water draining through a metal pipe. The laundry on the lined shirts in faded tones of blue and cream. Long stockings, a child's smock, fluttered like sleepy flags in the warm air. Each piece she folded held its own story, though she never spoke them aloud. Shirt with a loose button reminded her of last week's dinner, when her husband had leaned forward to laugh at something their daughter had said, unaware the thread had begun to give way. A pillowcase bore the faintest trace of starch along one edge, and she remembered fluffing that very pillow the night before, easing it beneath her child's head after a late-night fever had passed. There was comfort in these small labors, not in the work alone, but in what the work preserved: order, care, rhythm. The folding of a towel became a meditation, a slow unwinding of the hours. Her hands moved not with mechanical repetition, but with a softness drawn from memory. These were the same motions she had learned as a girl in her grandmother's house down south, where the sun hit differently. And a scent of clean laundry mingled with the honeysuckle that clung to the porch rails in Harlem. There was no honeysuckle, but there were other fragrances: street-roasted peanuts, coal smoke, rose oil dabbed behind ears on Sunday mornings. And there was always the quiet perfume of soap-dried fabric, warmed by the sun. It clung to the towels and undershirts now, a smell not strong but unmistakably clean, undeniably home. As she worked, her mind drifted, not far, just softly. She thought of the women in other buildings, their porches too narrow, their baskets just as full. Some she knew by name, others only by the shape of their arms as they hung sheets or pulled water from the rooftop tanks. In a way, they were all connected, chief one a quiet keeper of her own domestic rhythm, folding, scrubbing, preserving, A breeze rose then, gentle but full, and lifted the hanging garments in a sighing wave. It passed through the porch like a breath, cooling the back of her neck and bringing with it the scent of baking bread, faint and elusive. She closed her eyes briefly, letting the moment pass through her. Then, returning to the basket, she drew out a white cotton slip, smoothed it over her forearm, and folded it in thirds. The fabric, worn soft over time, retained the shape of the body that had worn it, the memory of movement, of gesture, of ordinary days. In that way, perhaps, laundry held memory, not in a grand or poetic sense, but in a tactile one, v'd by stair steps, collars smudged with a faint shadow of hair, pomade. The handkerchief folded into a lunch pail and returned without a word. These details were not recorded in diaries. They did not become stories passed down at family gatherings. But they lived here in the weight of the basket, the warmth of sun-dried cotton, the curve of her shoulder still imprinted in a sleeve. She paused, leaning briefly against the porch railing. The wood was warm beneath her forearms, and the sky above was pale blue, soft at the edges. Somewhere in the distance, a train rumbled, too far to be seen, its vibrations faint but steady. A bee buzzed near the edge of a hanging sheet, then darted away, uninterested. And in that moment, between folds, between breaths, time seemed to stretch gently. Not to stop, but to settle. She reached again for another towel, unfolded it to shake out a hidden crease, and began the ritual once more. As the day eased gently into its quieter hours, the woman continued her folding on the narrow porch, each motion steady and thoughtful, like the slow turning of pages in a well-worn book. The basket beside her gradually lightened, though she barely noticed. Her thoughts moved not in straight lines, but in quiet spirals, circling around memory, habit, and the muted beauty of her ordinary afternoon. Across the alley, the neighbor's clothesline was filled with bright cotton dresses, a few with faded embroidery near the collars, stitched by hands likely no longer living. A pair of children's bloomers danced gently at the end of the line, fluttering like leaves. The neighbor, herself a widow, named Mrs. Lyons, peeked through a parted curtain, nodded in passing acknowledgement, then retreated back into the dimness of her kitchen. There was no need for words. Stately choreography had long ago established its quiet understanding. The folded clothes began to stack in small, satisfying piles. Towels with towels, shirts with shirts, underthings tucked discreetly beneath. She smoothed each piece with the flat of her palm, checking seams and hems, noticing where threads had loosened or fabric had thinned from wear. She made mental notes to mend a tear, reinforce a cuff, replace a missing button with one kept in the jar of spares she'd been saving for years, a small glass vessel with a screw top and the faintest aroma of camphor. The sun had begun its slow descent, and shadows lengthened across the alley. The warmth on her skin softened, replaced with the cooler tones of late afternoon. A breeze swept through again, more consistent now, rustling the drying sheets like sails. Somewhere below, a delivery boy whistled tunelessly, his footsteps echoing against the stone as he disappeared down the alley. The woman's mind wandered back to her mother, who had taught her the art of folding precisely like this, corner to corner, smoothing with the knuckles, never rushing. Her mother had folded clothes on a wide back porch shaded by pecan trees, the scent of magnolia blossoms often mixing with the soap. It had been warmer there, the air thicker, and yet the act was the same. The folding of fabric as a form of preservation, of order, of memory. Laundry, in many ways, had been the silent witness to generations. It saw what others missed. It bore the sweat of long days, the scent of unfamiliar cities, the imprint of someone held close or someone long gone. And when the garments were clean again, when they were folded and returned to drawers and shelves, they offered something quietly profound: continuity. The sense that life, in all its changes, could still be held together by cotton threads and wooden pins. Below the porch, a clatter of glass against metal suggested the grocer was setting up crates for tomorrow's deliveries. The sound echoed softly, not jarring but present, grounding the moment. A sparrow landed briefly on the railing, cocked its head, and flew off again, disappearing between buildings. The final pieces in the basket were smaller handkerchiefs, a pair of socks, a child's apron used in pretend play. She folded them with equal care, resisting the temptation to hurry, even as the light waned. Each piece received her full attention, not out of necessity, but because the ritual deserved it. Her daughter had come to sit near the doorway, legs tucked beneath her, scribbling quietly in a composition book. The child spoke only once, asking if the wind could ever carry away a shirt if it wasn't pinned down. The woman smiled gently and said it could, but only if one wasn't careful. The child nodded, satisfied, and went back to drawing. It was a small exchange, but it lingered, like the scent of freshly folded linen. In the distance, church bells chimed the hour. Not loudly, but with that rounded softness bells acquire when filtered through brick and time. She listened without counting the tones. It didn't matter what hour it was. Her rhythm belonged to a different clock one, decked not with gears, but with habit and breath. With the basket now empty and the clothes stacked in neat bundles, she remained for a few moments longer, her hands resting in her lap. The back porch, though narrow and modest, had become a kind of sanctuary, space where time slowed, where sound softened, where memory came not in images, but in textures creased linen, damp cotton, the soft rasp of fabric between fingers. She would soon rise, gather the stacks, and return them to drawers and closets where they belonged. But not yet. For now, the light still clung gently to the edges of the railing. The wind still rustled the last of the laundry on the line, and her thoughts, untroubled, floated somewhere between now and then. Between this day and those long past, the moment held her not with force, but with invitation. And she allowed herself to remain within it, suspended, quiet, folded like linen, in a basket of memory as the final hour of sunlight slid across the rear of the brownstone. The back porch began to shift in texture. No longer sunlit, it turned golden, then amber, then softly blue at the edges, its corners filling with shadow. Its sounds fading into the hush that accompanied the end of each day. The laundry line, now still, held garments in silhouette, and the folded stacks sat nearby like quiet witnesses to a life gently tended. The woman stood slowly, brushing a stray thread from her skirt. Her knees ached faintly, as they often did after a day spent walking between the laundry basin, the kitchen, and the porch. But it was a familiar ache, not unwelcome. It was the ache of purpose, of work completed, of hours stitched together into something useful and orderly. She gathered the folded clothes into the basket once more, this time light and easy to lift. Each stack was placed with care, balanced, just so, cushioned by the softest garments to prevent wrinkling. As she turned to go inside, her eyes caught the light one final time as it dipped behind the rooftops. Farewell. Perhaps just a pause. Inside, the house had already begun its evening transformation. Lamps were lit, casting halos across walls and ceilings. The faint smell of starch had faded, replaced now by the scent of supper warming on the stove. Something simple, maybe rice and stewed tomatoes, the kind of meal that filled the room with warmth more than with aroma. A low hum came from the hallway, her daughter's voice, talking to a doll or rehearsing a poem she'd heard at school. She placed the laundry basket beside the bedroom dresser and began to return each folded item to its place. The drawers opened with a soft wooden sigh, their interiors lined with scraps of old newspaper, their edges curled and yellowed. Some garments were stacked with other shirts alongside undershirts, towels by washcloths, all in quiet harmony. Each drawer closed again with a gentle thud, like the closing of a book. When she came to her daughter's room, she knocked lightly before entering. The child looked up, grinned, and went back to her game. The mother set the small pile of clean clothes on the end of the bed and smoothed the top item with her palm. A nightgown soft, faded at the seams, but loved. It smelled of sunshine and soap. Later, when the house had quieted and her daughter was tucked in for sleep, the woman returned to the kitchen. She poured a shallow basin of water and soaked a cloth to wipe her hands and neck. The coolness was refreshing, like a breath after long conversation. She dried herself on one of the freshly folded towels and smiled faintly at the neatness of it, the completeness. Everything, it seemed, had found its place. The back porch, now dark, lay silent behind the curtain, but its memory lingered in her muscles, in the scent of fabric still caught in her sleeves, in the softness of her skin after hours of working with clean cotton. The labor of folding clothes had passed, but the calm it brought remained. She could feel it inside her, not pride, not fatigue, but a kind of settledness. The quiet after the final note of a lullaby. Before bed, she sat by the small window in the parlor, sipping warm water with lemon. Outside, the alley lay still. Somewhere, a phonograph played in the distance muted jazz, drifting upward. The tune was familiar, though she couldn't name it. It curled around her like thread, thin and golden, connecting the porch to the parlor, the present to memory. She thought then of all the women before her who had done the same, folding, tending, mending. Their lives weren't captured in the papers, but they lived on in these gestures, in the straightness of a hem, in the scent of lye on cotton, in the way a blouse, once crumpled and forgotten, became something clean, smooth, and whole again. The folding of clothes was more than routine. It was a quiet act of love. Not the love that asks for thanks or recognition, but the love that weaves itself into the details of daily life. It's a kind that doesn't speak loudly, but remains folded carefully in a drawer, ready for another day. She would sleep well tonight, not out of exhaustion, but because she had moved through her hours with care, and care, when repeated often enough, became its own kind of prayer. As she finished her water and rose to turn down the lamp, she glanced once more toward the darkened porch. The laundry would hang until morning. It would catch the early light as the sun returned, golden and forgiving. And she, like the garments she'd folded, would rise again, creased with memory, warmed by the light, softened by the work of days gone by. The kitchen was always the first to stir, long before the rest of the brownstone's rooms blinked into wakefulness. Not with alarm bells or sudden clamor, but with small, familiar sounds. The gentle shift of wood against wood as a cupboard door opened, the quiet click of a match striking, then the soft whoosh of flame catching beneath a stovetop burner. These were the first breaths of the house each morning, steady and unassuming. On the rear burner, where the flame burned lower and the heat rose slow and even, the tin coffee pot found its usual place. Dented at the base and slightly warped at the rim, it had served for over a decade without complaint. Its curved spout had poured countless mornings into existence, its handle warm but never scorching. When empty, it made the faintest metallic ring when set down, like a distant bell muffled by fog. The woman who placed it there each day knew precisely how long it took for the percolator inside to begin its gentle, bubbling rhythm. The sound would start faint, almost imperceptible, then swell gradually into a steady, pulsing cadence, like a heartbeat marking the pace of the morning. To her, it was a comfort. To her daughter, it meant breakfast was near. And to the house itself, it was a signal that the day had quietly begun. The aroma that soon unfurled was unmistakable, dark, robust, and deeply earthy. It mingled with the scent of aging floorboards, faint gas from the stove, and the subtle sweetness of whatever had been baked the evening before. Some mornings it competed with the buttery fragrance of biscuits rising in the oven. Other days with fried cornmeal or leftover slices of sweet potato pie warmed slowly on a skillet. But always the scent of the coffee remained the anchor, weaving itself into the very fabric of the air in the front parlor. Separated from the kitchen by a narrow hallway and a folding door with painted trim, sat an upright piano. Its surface bore a fine layer of dust, not from neglect, but from the simple truth that time in this household moved through more necessary tasks. Yet still, the piano stood an inheritance, both literal and symbolic, from an aunt who had once taught music to neighborhood children. Its keys, some ivory, some chipped, held the memory of spiritual's lullabies, and the hesitant progressions of young hands learning scales on humid summer afternoons, when the coffee was ready, poured into thick ceramic mugs with tiny cracks like veins in old porcelain. The woman would sometimes sit near that piano, not at it, but beside it on a cushioned bench that creaked under her weight. She rarely played now, though she had once known how. The movements had grown distant in her fingers, like a language half forgotten but not entirely lost. Sometimes, when the morning was particularly still, she would rest her hand on the wood, feeling the faint echo of former songs within. Her daughter, however, was drawn to it a few times a week, just after breakfast and before the clatter of dishes began. The child would press a few keys, not in melody, but in exploration. The notes that emerged were soft, hesitant, unpracticed, but never unwelcome. The woman never stopped her. These sounds, like the bubbling of the coffee pot or the click of the gas lamp, were simply part of the home's morning texture. The keys themselves bore the touch of time. Some had yellowed, a few stuck slightly, and one near the center gave a dull thunk instead of a tone. But the others still sang, even if faintly. They sang of Sunday evenings when neighbors gathered, of the aunt's voice weaving between him and history, and of quiet afternoons when the daughter traced the scales with a single index finger while the coffee cooled beside her mother. The parlor's light came in long, soft bars, filtered through gauzy curtains, hand-stitched years before. The shadows on the floor shifted slowly, mapping the movement of the sun across the day. The piano absorbed that light, Tooth's dark wood, gently reflecting the morning gold. The corners, softened by dust and memory. On the wall above it hung a framed photograph, CPI-toned and slightly faded. The aunt, in her younger years, seated at this very piano, surrounded by schoolchildren with bowed heads and folded hands. The photograph had been there so long that the wallpaper beneath it had paled into a perfect square. The woman dusted the frame each week, not out of obligation, but because she remembered the sound of her aunt's playing the way her fingers had glided. Not hurried, but sure. Sometimes, if a breeze slipped through the open front window and rustled the sheet music tucked inside the bench, the woman would glance toward it. She would think, just briefly, of playing again, not for show, not even for memory, but simply for the sound of it, the low hum of bass chords, the delicate fall of upper octaves, the space between notes. And yet, each morning passed gently, without that decision. The coffee was sipped slowly, the piano remained still, and the house continued to exhale its quiet warmth. There was no rush, no need. The rituals of the day were already unfolding, the clatter of plates, the brush of skirts against doorway frames, the hush of footsteps across linoleum dot. Still, in the quiet of those early hours, there was a kind of music, not always heard, but always present. In the bubbling pot, in the steady breath of the parlor, in the imagined echo of keys not pressed, and in that music's soft, grounding, slow. The morning found its rhythm once more. By late morning, The tin coffee pot had cooled, surface no longer warm to the touch, but retaining the scent of the day's first pour. It rested now on the counter, waiting to be rinsed, its rounded belly reflecting faint shapes from the kitchen's mottled light. The woman moved past it slowly, not ignoring it, but allowing it to rest, knowing its work, like hers, would begin again tomorrow. Across the hallway, the parlor had brightened, the lace curtains trembling in the rising air. The street beyond remained calm, with the occasional creak of wagon wheels or the brief call of a neighbor tending to an errand. Inside, the quiet reigned, the kind of quiet that didn't demand attention. It merely settled. The woman had dusted the piano earlier in the week, running a soft cloth along the crown and around the edges of the keys. She didn't polish it, it wasn't necessary, but she cared for it just enough to let it breathe. This morning, as the light struck the keys at a soft angle, her daughter approached again, this time with a cautious kind of excitement. The child didn't speak, but opened the bench slowly, revealing a cluster of old sheet music stored inside some loose, bound together with twine. The mother watched from the doorway as the girl sifted through the pages, her small fingers tracing the faded titles. The Maple Leaf Rag, Negro Spirituals Volume 2, Soft Winds for Sunday Morning. Many pages bore annotations in pencil, tiny reminders written in the hand of the aunt who once lived in the room upstairs. Some were musical, some simply instructive. Breathe here. Pause and feel the silence. The girl placed one page on the stand and climbed onto the bench. Her feet didn't reach the floor, but her hands found the keys. She pressed them carefully, one note at a time, searching not for song, but for sound. The music that emerged wasn't recognizable, but it had shape. It moved with thought. It wandered. The woman didn't interrupt. Instead, she sat just beyond the doorway, her lap filled with a clean tea towel she had intended to hem, but her hands stayed still, and her eyes remained on her daughter. Its brow furrowed slightly in concentration. The sound of the piano was gentle, like distant raindrops tapping on a window pane. Notes hung in the air without demand. Some were clear, others muffled, but each carried the quiet joy of exploration. When the girl missed a note, she didn't sigh or begin again. She simply let it pass, pressing on to the next. The keys gave under her touch, never resisting, always ready to offer what they could. Above them, on the wall, the photograph of the aunt seemed to lean forward ever so slightly, as though listening. The woman liked to imagine that, in some subtle way, her aunt's spirit lingered in the instrument's worn wood and hollow body, not as a ghost, but as memory made tangible. After a while, the girl stopped playing. She didn't announce it, or close the lid. She simply left the bench and walked to her mother's side, curling beside her and resting her head against her arm. They sat like that for a while. Neither spoke. The music had not been performance, and there was no need for applause. It had simply existed. And now it had passed. In the kitchen, the woman rose and began preparing lunch. Slices of cornbread from last night were warmed on the skillet, their edges crisping slowly in a thin layer of butter. Collard greens simmered on the back burner with smoked meat and a pinch of vinegar. The aromas curled through the hallway, greeting each room with their rich, familiar presence. From the doorway, the girl asked about the aunt, the one in the picture, what she was like, whether she'd had a piano in every house. The woman smiled, her hands moving steadily as she stirred the pot. She spoke not in long stories, but in fragments. She wore hats even inside. She never missed church. She once played through a thunderstorm without looking up. The girl listened, but she didn't press for more. She seemed content with the brushstrokes, with the impressionistic outline of someone who had once played the same keys she had. Touched only minutes ago. After lunch, the dishes were rinsed and stacked. The house settled again. Outside, The neighborhood had woken fully now. Laughter from the sidewalk, a hammer somewhere down the block, the soft clink of glass bottles being sorted by a vendor. The woman opened the window to let in the afternoon air, warm and full of distant city life. In the parlor, the piano remained open, not dramatically, slightly lifted, keys exposed, as if waiting. The sheet music still sat on the stand, its edges curling slightly in the breeze. And though no one touched it for the rest of the day, it held presence. It reminded the house of the morning's sounds. It remembered the child's fingers, the mother's watchful stillness, the way light had moved across the bench, and the tin coffee pot, rinsed and left to dry beside the sink, caught the same light's dull surface warmed by the windows. Glow. Though empty now, it would be filled again. And the piano, though silent, would sound again. Not today, perhaps, but soon. In this home, objects were not simply things. They were threads, quiet connections between the past and the present, between action and rest, between music and silence. They didn't ask for attention. They only needed care. And as the woman sat once more in the doorway, needle in hand, fabric across her lap, she let her thoughts drift not far, just gently across the lines of music, the scent of cornbread, and the hush of a well-used key pressed softly by a small, determined hand. As the day turned gently toward dusk, the piano remained quiet, its keys at rest, its wood deepening in hue as the afternoon light softened and began to withdraw. The sheet music on the stand curled a bit further, lifted at one edge by the breeze from the open window. Outside, Harlem's soundscape mellowed, still alive, but no longer insisting. A few voices passed by below, speaking low and unhurried. Somewhere, a door closed with a distant thud, and a faint whistle trailed into the evening. The woman moved through the home with the familiar rhythm of late day. She wiped down the kitchen counters with a damp cloth, wringing it out carefully before folding it over the sink's edge to dry. The scent of cooked greens still lingered in the air, mingling now with the faint perfume of talcum powder and the clean husk of ironing starch. She didn't need to rush supper. It would be a light one, perhaps leftover cornbread with a bit of honey or sliced apples with cheese. Meals like this were common during the midweek when everyone was a little tired, a little slow, and grateful for quiet. The house itself seemed to approve, settling deeper into its bones with every creak and sigh of the floorboards. Her daughter had returned to the parlor, this time not to play, but to sit cross-legged on the rug near the piano, arranging paper. Dolls in neat rows occasionally looked toward the bench, perhaps wondering if she might press another key, or perhaps just listening to the quiet the instrument left behind. She didn't speak. The house seemed to have invited silence, and they honored it. The tin coffee pot, dried and returned to its corner shelf, sat with a kind of humble pride. Its work was complete for the day. But it was more than a vessel. It was a signal, a comfort, a marker in the unfolding of time. It had been part of every morning, every conversation whispered in the stillness, every pause between chores. The woman often wondered how many hands had held it, how many quiet hours it had accompanied. It had no inscription, no special mark, but it had presence. A kind of memory embedded in its dense and dull shine, and so, too, did the piano. Though no one played it every day, its resonance could be felt throughout the home. It lived in the way the daughter hummed when brushing her hair, in the rhythm of footsteps along the hallway. In the slow, almost musical way meals were prepared. The woman had once read that sound lingers in wood, that instruments, especially pianos, remember every note ever played. She liked to think that was true, that the echoes of her aunt's playing still lived within the piano's frame, like shadows held in the grain. The evening deepened. A golden glow crept up the walls as the sun lowered behind the rooftops, casting long lines through the window slats. The woman lit the lamp beside the settee, its flame low and steady, casting a pool of soft light across the room. The shadows of the piano keys stretched toward the far wall, long and narrow, like fingers reaching slowly into memory. She sat once more beside the piano, not on the bench, but beside it, as she had done that morning, her fingers resting on. Her lap twitched slightly with the impulse to press a chord, but she resisted, not out of fear nor sadness, but simply because she was listening to the quiet hum of the house, to the near silence that settles only when everything is in its proper place. Her daughter looked up from her dolls and asked softly, "Do you think Auntie's songs are still in there?" Pointing at the piano. The woman smiled gently and nodded. "I think they are," she said. "Okay, even if we can't hear them all the time." That answer seemed enough. "Okay." The child turned back to her play, and the moment folded softly into the next dot. Soon, the routine of bedtime would begin, the careful unpinning of braids, the setting out of clothes for the next morning, the slow brushing of teeth by gaslight. The house would darken room by room, each lamp dimmed, each door eased shut. But for now, there was still a little light. The woman rose and gently closed the piano lid. It made a soft sound, not a click, but a hush. She laid the sheet music flat and tucked it back inside the bench, where it would wait until the next morning, or perhaps the one after that. The keys would rest, untouched but not forgotten, until curiosity or memory brought them to life again. And the tin coffee pot, resting in its corner with the last light catching on its rim, seemed to nod in agreement. Morning would return, as it always did, and the quiet rituals would unfold once more. There was no need to mark time here with anything more than that the coffee steam, the soft fall of fingers on ivory, the scent of starch and simmered greens. These were the true clocks of the household, ticking not with urgency, but with care. As night gently drew its curtain across the city, the woman stood at the window, her hands resting on the sill. The street lights flickered to life, one by one, their glow diffused by summer haze. The world outside continued, steady and vast, but inside, within the hush of her rooms, the music of daily life had played its last note for the day, and it was enough. Saturday mornings in the brownstone moved at a different rhythm, neither slower nor faster, but with a deliberate sense of preparation. The week had already passed through its cycle of chores and meals, school books and supper bowls, and now the home shifted its attention inward. In the soft warmth of the kitchen, beneath the filtered light that slanted through the back window, it was hair day. The table had already been cleared, the oilcloth wiped and folded back to reveal the smooth wood beneath. A towel was draped over one chair, and beside it sat a shallow basin filled with warm water, its surface quiet, touched faintly by steam. On the counter, a fine-toothed comb rested beside a brush with warm bristles, a small tin of pressing oil, and a jar of blue hair pomade, whose scent was sweet and herbal with a faint medicinal trace. The oil smelled of castor and coconut, warm even before the tin was placed near the stove to soften. The woman took her time arranging these items, as she always did. Each jar opened gently, each tool wiped clean, each motion unhurried. Her daughter, already washed and wearing a house dress with a frayed hem, waited patiently on the edge of the kitchen stool. Her hands were folded in her lap, her eyes watchful but calm. She had done this every Saturday since she was old enough to sit still. Outside, Harlem pulsed with the beginning of weekend sounds. The call of street vendors drifted through the open window, the fruit man with his crate of peaches, the newspaper boy announcing headlines. Farther away, the high, thin notes of a trumpet lifted through the city haze, a melody rising from some unseen stoop or studio. But within the kitchen, time curled inward. The woman dipped a cloth into the warm basin and began to dampen her daughter's hair, parting it gently with her fingers. The water darkened the curls, pulling them downward, heavy with moisture. She moved in small, practiced motions, soaking each section evenly, careful not to let the water trickle down the girl's back. The scent of clean scalp mingled with that of the lye soap used in the morning wash, a scent, not sharp, not honest, softened by the warmth of the room. Next came the oil. She scooped a small amount with 2 fingers and rubbed it between her palms until it shone. With slow care, she smoothed it through the strands, working it from root to end, coaxing the coils into softness. The scent, deep and rich, nutty, and slightly sweet. It filled the air without overpowering, anchoring the morning in something both ancient and familiar. She parted the hair with the tail of the comb, her fingers guiding the shape of each line. The sound of the comb moving through hair was soft but distinct, a hushed rasp, a rhythm that rose and fell like waves. The girl winced once, slightly, and the woman paused to let her settle. "Almost through," she murmured. "It was always said, and always true." Eventually, as the pressing comb heated on the stove's smallest flame, the woman braided sections, letting them rest in thick ropes along the girl's shoulders. She worked from the base of the neck upward, her hands moving in time with the quiet music of the house, the creak of a cabinet door, the pop of the wood stove adjusting to the morning chill, the slow exhale of the city just beyond the window. Occasionally, she would hum, not a full tune, just a thread of melody, maybe something from church, maybe a lullaby once sung by her own mother on her own hair day. The girl never asked what it was. She just listened, eyes fixed on the oilcloth's pattern or the slant of the sun across the countertop. Once the pressing comb was ready, tested with a drop of water that sizzled and vanished, the woman wrapped a towel around her daughter's shoulders, lifted one braid at a time, and slowly began to press. The scent changed again, sharpened briefly, a mingling of heat and oil, but never harsh. It was the scent of Saturday, of preparation, of care. The girl remained still, save for a twitch here or a glance there. She was old enough to understand the importance of stillness. The hot comb's path was slow and careful, its metal teeth stretching the curl, gliding down each strand, transforming texture into length with a faint, satisfying hiss. After each section, the woman wrapped it around her fingers, then pinned it loosely to the scalp to cool. The process took time. There was no rushing it, no shortcut. It was not just about hair. It was about attention, about patience, about the way hands move when they know the shape of someone else's head as well as their own. And in that long, quiet hour, something deeper happened too. Without words, the mother passed down history, not in lectures or stories, but in the press of palm against crown, in the parting of thick curls, in the smell of hot oil and soap. The girl would carry this with her, not in memory, perhaps, but in the way she would one day do the same for another. Outside, a breeze shifted the curtain, and the woman paused to look through the window. Across the alley, another mother sat with a daughter in her lap, comb in hand. Their gaze met briefly, no wave, no nod, but a mutual recognition. The ritual was not theirs alone. It belonged to many. It stretched back beyond brownstones, beyond cities, beyond memory. Back in the kitchen, the pressing continued. The sun moved a little higher, warming the tin of pomade until its scent bloomed anew. The girl's eyes had begun to close now, her body still, her trust complete. The kitchen, filled with its quiet tools and Saturday stillness, held them gently in its breath. The pressing continued, quiet and unhurried. As mid-morning sunlight crept across the kitchen floor, the light struck the back of the daughter's chair now, catching in the sheen of her freshly oiled hair, in the thin wisps that refused to lie flat, no matter how gently coaxed. The woman worked patiently, her fingers steady, guiding the heated comb through section after section with care born not only of repetition, but of tenderness, The rhythm had become its own kind of silence. The gentle scrape of the comb, the hiss where heat met oil, the occasional creak of the stool as the child shifted her weight, all of it combined into something almost sacred. Outside, life moved with more haste. Shouted greetings from the corner, a child's shout chasing a runaway ball, the clatter of a vendor's cartwheels on uneven pavement. But none of that touched the stillness of the kitchen. A soft breeze slipped through the open window, carrying with it the scent of coal smoke from a nearby chimney, and something sweeter perhaps, sugar frying in a pan somewhere down the alley. The woman paused a moment to listen, pressing her palm gently to the crown of her daughter's head. The touch was not to still her, but to remind her that she was there. She moved to the next section. The hair was thick but pliant, warmed by the comb and softened by the oil. She worked. She began to hum again, just under her breath. The tune was older than she could name, passed down without words, its origin folded into the rhythm of care. Her daughter didn't ask for music, but she always listened when it came. Each straightened section was coiled and pinned carefully. Not too tight. She didn't believe in pulling until the scalp ached, but neat enough to last through Sunday morning. Tomorrow was church, after all, and hair day was as much a part of preparing for that as starching the dress or polishing the shoes. The ritual shaped the week's flow, forming a loop that reset gently each Saturday. On the table, the tools remained in quiet order. The tin of pressing oil, now half emptied, gleamed softly in the light. The comb, resting between uses on a folded cloth, gave off the faintest curl of heat. The brush lay still, its bristles dark with oil, its handle worn smooth by years of use. The woman lifted a final section of hair, smaller than the rest. It was the edge, the part where curls met temple, where baby hairs curled defiantly along the skin, no matter how much oil or time was offered. She didn't force them. Instead, she smoothed them gently with her fingers, leaving them in place, as they wished to be. Not everything needed to be pressed into form. As she finished, she let her hands rest lightly on the child's shoulders, just for a moment. Then she began the gentle undoing of the pinned sections, letting the hair fall in long, softened waves. The transformation was subtle but clear. Where before the hair had gathered in thick, dense coils, it now shimmered slightly, catching the light with its new shape. Not straighter so much as quieter, like cloth drawn tight and laid smooth across the grain. Her daughter turned slightly, eyes half-lidded with calm, and looked up. The woman nodded once, her approval silent but complete. "Go on," she said softly. "Let it rest." The girl slid off the stool and padded toward the parlor, her feet bare, the hem of her dress brushing the tops of her ankles. She moved slowly, still carrying the stillness of the morning with her. Left alone in the kitchen, the woman began to gather the tools. She rinsed the comb first, holding it carefully under warm water and drying it with an old tea towel. Then she wiped the oil tin clean, setting it back on its shelf. The pomade was closed tightly, its lid clicking into place. Each item was returned to its home, not rushed, not forgotten. The towel that had covered her daughter's shoulders was folded and hung over the chair to air out. The water in the basin was poured out the back door, its warmth steaming briefly in the alley's cooler shade. The scent of pressing oil still lingered, not overpowering, but clinging to the corners of the room like memory. As she cleaned, her thoughts wandered gently. She remembered her own mother's hands, firm but kind, smoothing her hair in the kitchen, not unlike this one. The same comb, perhaps, the same scent, the same Saturday sun angling in just so. These things didn't change. Not really. The tools wore down, the hands changed, but the ritual remained, and through that ritual, something deeper passed, a kind of inheritance that could not be written, only performed. This was in the way the fingers parted the hair, the way oil was, warmed just so, the way a child learned to sit still and trust that nothing would hurt her in that chair. Not the heat, not the comb, not the world waiting beyond the door. When the kitchen was once again in order, the woman sat for a moment, her palms open in her lap, still holding the faint sheen of oil. She breathed in, slowly, the scent of castor and coconut and warmth. It was the smell of care, of time taken, of knowing that even the smallest acts could mean everything.